Hello and welcome to the Coralosophy Podcast. This is episode 95. Your school's PD is not evidence-based, with Dr. Kristina Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is someone I found on TikTok. Yes, believe it or not, you are hearing a podcast guest that I simply trolled on TikTok, and I figured out how to get in touch with her because she was speaking my language on her TikTok. We'll talk about that more later, but teachers, this is the episode you want to send to your administrators. Probably the last one was when I did my first COVID episode with Dr. Adalja. I heard about so many people who sent that episode to their administrators. This is going to be one of those ones too, that you want to start a conversation and let me be the bad guy with Dr. Mitchell, with your administrators. I'm sure that your admin will be really excited to get this message, which is essentially that the things that we preach in our professional developments as these evidence-based solutions for better teaching are not really that evidence-based at all in some cases. Dr. Kristina Mitchell is an education researcher who specializes in instructional methodology. She also enjoys challenging the assumptions that many educators and school districts make when it comes to instructional scripture, like learning objectives or learning styles, both of which are kind of myths. Okay, we get into the weeds of why providing robust evidence for these, I'm going to make up a term here, Edu-Fads, is nearly impossible. Then we branch into even more hot button topics, which was not planned, and I thought it was really good because it was organic and relevant. But we talked about evidence problems in general in science, of how hard it is to actually prove things like masking and COVID. And we even drifted somehow into critical race theory and how it's taught and argued about in education. So this is just a really fun conversation. You're going to really enjoy Dr. Mitchell. Just a reminder that this show gets a lot of support from its Patreon. Patreon.com/Coralosophy is a subscriber-only website that allows listeners to the show to take their support up a notch in terms of financial, $3 a month. Not that big of a deal, but it helps me a lot. It adds up over time, but also emotional support, moral support. You get a private podcast feed there. You get a bag full of goodies, so to speak, in the form of my Google folder, as well as some swag options there. So you want to go check that out. That's patreon.com/Coralosophy. The Patreon producers are Brannigan Lawrence, Vasquez Academy of Music, John Warner, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, Chandler Smith, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Jeff Wall, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. Here's Dr. Kristina Mitchell. Okay, everybody, I'm here with Kristina Mitchell, who is an education researcher, which is super fancy, and I'm super impressed, and I'm super excited also to talk about this, the idea that sometimes as teachers, we do things in the classroom that we think is really sciencey, but oftentimes it's not. And I came across Kristina's TikTok, which is a hoot, by the way. Everybody needs to go follow Kristina on TikTok, and we'll talk more about that later. But Kristina, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about you, other than my little just goofy intro that I gave. Who are you? Where do you come from? And what do you do now?
Sure. So I'm an original Texan, but now I'm a Californian. I'm an educator. So I teach at San Jose State University. I teach scientific research methods, and I also teach other classes in the political science department. Because by training, I'm a social scientist. So that's kind of how I got into education research. Once I finished my PhD and started teaching, I started hearing all kinds of claims about, what education strategies I should be using. And I thought, these seem like testable claims that I could use my social science training to test. And so that's what I started doing. So I've got several education research publications. I have quite a few working papers, and now I am doing also some work for a local Silicon Valley education technology startup, helping them with some education research and just, wearing a lot of hats. My title is Director of Learning Innovations. If you know what that is, please let me know, because I still have no idea.
That is hilarious. But you just get to put the sign on the door, so to speak?
Yeah, put it on my nameplate.
That's great. Okay, so I think first I want to dive in just because I mentioned I found you on TikTok, and one of the things I appreciate, I have not figured out TikTok yet. I have a couple videos on there, but I just have not figured out how to make or even care. You seem to be able to communicate some concrete concepts with a sense of humor and with fun, and it's really enjoyable to watch. But it also sparked me to ask you more questions, because as an educator, I will watch one of your, and please don't take this the wrong way, silly little videos. But then I would come away thinking, oh my God, I want to talk to her because I've been teaching for almost 20 years, and I have sat through so many PD sessions where I am being presented with the new fad that we will do because a book told us to, and there never seems to be a time in the meeting for me to just raise my hand and say, but why? And how do you know? And it sounds like that's kind of where you come in.
Yeah, I definitely think that is my goal. So my ultimate thinking, based on what I've done in education research so far, is that education's really hard to research well. It's hard to do science about education. It's hard to do any social science, which I think is why social scientists are uniquely qualified to study education. Because it's not like physics where you go into a lab. I don't actually know what physicists do, but I imagine they have like a telescope and like study particles. I don't really know, but it seems logical to me. But they have situations where they can control so much of what they're observing, or chemists who can put things in a beaker and make it blow up or something. Those are lab conditions you can control. In human beings, not so much. So when in political scientists studying education, not education. Do you want me to start over? Do we edit?
I can if you want me to, but
Okay,
we don't
sorry.
normally
I
because no
didn't know
one
this
really
was
cares. People like my
true
show because we're just loosey. We're not making
conversational.
presentations here. Yeah.
Okay, good. So when political scientists study things like elections, you can't go back and rerun the election modifying one variable. You can't say, well, what if Joe Biden was Black? What would happen? How would it be different? We can't do that. We can't study that.
Yeah.
So we have to use the best tools that we have available to us as scientists. And that means that it's harder to get robust findings. Now, it's not impossible. It's just harder. And what I find in education research is that the standards are often not as robust as in some other social science disciplines. And that's not a dig on education researchers. It just means that we can think about it differently, that the goal of education research should not be to prove what is the case, but to empower teachers to know what their options are. That, I think,
Mm.
is the real thing that we should take away from education research.
That's interesting. Now, do you have theories on why it's less robust or rigorous in education? Are there driving forces kind of under the surface that might lead to that?
I think there could be a lot. And I'm going to just talk only about one because I could probably spend this whole time talking about all of them. But I think one is that any time in society that we deem something women's work, we
Hmm.
tend to view it through a different lens and value it less. So we even see this in other social sciences where things like economics are treated more seriously with more gravitas than something like sociology. Because I think one explanation is because economics is associated with like men and the patriarchy, and something like sociology or teaching is associated with women. And so it just hasn't been given the same level of seriousness in the way science as a discipline is treating it. So that's just one explanation, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, I think you could be right. I would probably add a layer to that, which is that just from what I've observed, which is yes, there is the perception that especially certain types of teaching is women's work, but it's also maybe that it's seen by people outside of education as something that is intuitive driven. So like if you just care enough about the kids, then you can get through them, get through to them, and there is a certain amount of female nurturing stereotype that plays into that too, just in our human psychology, that they don't, typically people who aren't teachers don't really understand the nuts and bolts of what it is that we do and how we, for lack of a better term, hack a kid's brain into wanting to learn stuff all of a sudden. Because there's an art to it, and there is I would say probably some parts of it will never be able to be proven by by an education researcher,
You're absolutely right.
as you were saying. That's interesting. Now, I also have a theory as to why that might be the case, and it has to do with the structure of school districts and kind of maybe the incentive structure for if let's say you've got a local school district and you have to put forward a a plan to your board of directors to prove that you are doing a good job. And one of the ways you would do that is you would come up with this really fancy looking, professional development program to train your teachers. And of course, it looks better if you have a bunch of citations with PhDs on the end, and you've got a book and it's got research based and all this. And so there is and there's also the incentive for those to keep changing all the time, because then the next board members come along and they want to put their stamp on things. Am I crazy?
I don't think you're crazy at all. And I honestly think that there's even more, I'm going to say more perverse incentives than that, because the federal government has programs like Title V, for example, that provide federal funding for schools that use evidence-based programs. And that seems like a good idea. I think that great. The government should give funding to schools that are using evidence-based programs. But then how do we define that? Well, the federal government created the What Works Clearinghouse, and that is a repository of programs that are evidence-based. Well, how do we prove that the program's evidence-based? Well, the people who wrote the program have to commission a study. So now we have companies and corporations who are funding research, and that research is used to determine whether their program can be used to get Title V funding from the government. So, I mean, the incentive isn't to do it well. The incentive is to get an answer.
There you go. Yes. And I'll go one level deeper into the rabbit hole. At the top of that chain is our politicians, essentially. So politicians run the system, and they've got to show that things are working. And of course, this is just you and I don't know each other very well, but this is a funny thing that happens in my life where I get told frequently, probably just because I use words in a pretty way, that I should run for office. I should run for the local. And I'm like, I don't think you want me to do that, because my campaign slogan would basically be, hey, vote for me, guys. I think I'm going to do a good job, but I'm not sure if my plan would work all that well. And you probably know more about your business than I do. And so, just vote for me and I'll do my best. That would be my campaign slogan. But of course, politicians don't operate that way. Politicians need to put forth here's what I'm doing that's right. And it is correct. And here's how I've proven that it's correct. And they need to, like you said, they need to have an answer. And I think maybe this where I'd be interested in kind of getting you to push back on me here a little bit at all, if you want, but the average person doesn't know or care if the answer is correct, because they're not going to read the paper. Don't forget, head to mymusicfolders.com and check out their great store online there of choir gear, folders, all kinds of paraphernalia that you need. Of course, your resident singers' masks. You can use Choirlosophy at checkout to get a discount. You can also bop over to their other website, mychoirrobes.com, and check out their choir robes. Get a discount there for choir robes. That discount helps a lot. Also, make sure you are up to date on your Sight Reading Factory memberships. SightReadingFactory.com is an excellent resource. You need it in your classroom for every single student, practicing at home, makeup work, for those snow days that become virtual days. It's a crucial tool for every teacher in every music classroom, not just choir. Send it to your band teachers, your orchestra teachers. Spread the word about SightReadingFactory.com.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You will get no pushback. I find this sometimes working at the startup that I work at, which I think is full of people who really want to do the right thing by students. And I think most companies want to do the right thing by students. I really don't think it's some vast conspiracy of people who want to put bad products into students' hands. I don't think that's what's going on.
Agreed.
But, I think we have a company that's thinking we need a study that can show whether our product is generating good outcomes. And then they don't know what to look at in the results to know whether this was done well. They're trusting someone, just like teachers are trusting someone to tell us this product will work. And sometimes we know what we want to do in the classroom. We take this product with evidence that it works and we say, this is working for me. I like it. I'm going to use it. Other times, though, we are being told, like you're getting in your PDs, this is what you need to be doing in your classroom. And you're going, I don't think that seems right. I don't think that's going to work for me. And instead of being told, okay, well, then let's talk to you. Let's figure out what other evidence-based programs might work. We're told, well, then you're the wrong one. It's you. You're the crazy one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Or it's just a smile and a nod and just move on. because of course the administrators are also they're caught in the middle. They're delivering a program that they were told to deliver by their bosses. And it's, yeah, no, I definitely have experienced that so many times. What I'm interested in now, if kind of even pivoting into the weeds just a little bit, on some examples that you could think of that maybe the typical teacher, rank and file everywhere, would know about, as like, here's a trend in education that everybody thinks is evidence-based, but maybe it's not. I mean, even if you shock some people and make them really angry, give us some examples.
Well, my favorite example is the one that I personally have published an article on, and that is the use of learning objectives in the classroom. So anybody who follows my TikTok is going to know that I come back to this very regularly. So we're often told, sometimes mandated as educators, you need to use learning objectives. They need to be worded in a specific way. You're going to use Bloom's taxonomy. You're going to put them on the board or in your syllabus. You need to reference them throughout your teaching, and that will improve your students' learning. So that's the idea. It's going to make your teaching better, and it's going to make the students learn more. And I think a lot of times as educators, we're like, that seems silly. Like, I'm not saying we should walk into class with no idea what we're going to teach, even though I've done that. And I know you've done that. We've all done that. But, it's good enough for me to know today I'm going to teach about asking a good research question. That's enough. I don't need a learning objective written in a certain way. Yet as educators, we're expected and required to do that. The research that's based on is not really well done. Most of it's not done in a quasi-experimental or experimental way. So my colleague and I, we heard this mandate that we have to use learning objectives, and we thought we can test this. So what we did is we looked at different sections of the same class. So the same class, we were teaching 3 different iterations of it. In one of those classes, we did just what the administrators wanted us to do. We wrote the learning objectives the right way. We referenced them in class. We talked about them. We made sure the students knew about them. Then in the second version, we wrote them and we had them available for students, but we never intentionally called them out.
Right.
And in the third class, we did the kind of learning objective that I would rather use, which is like, today we're going to learn about, research design. And that was it. There was no intentional way of wording the learning objectives, writing them. We only used it in our normal way as educators, that we would talk about what we're going to learn. And at the end, we asked the students in each of those 3 courses, how did you feel about the learning objectives? Did you use them? Did you read them? Do you think learning objectives are helpful? So that was one question, to see, does presenting them differently result in something different from our students' perceptions? And we found no, there was no statistically significant difference across the 3 sections. But then, of course, maybe they learn better if we use learning objectives in a different way. So we looked at what are their final exam scores, what are their scores in the course overall, to see, is this improving student performance in the class? And once again, no, there was no statistically significant difference in our students' perceptions or in their performance.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm trying to, the whole time you were explaining that, I was thinking about, as a music teacher, the way we deliver instruction is different, and a lot of times doesn't fit into the box that these new programs fall into. But in terms of learning objectives, I have taught for several years in a school. We're no longer being forced to do it, but for many years we were. We were expected to write them on the board, and just like you said, they need to be phrased a certain way, and they need to be there's all kinds of worksheets we did in our PD to make sure that they were written correctly. And then they had to be on display in the room all the time. Okay. But I think back to my time teaching, and I think of the best class periods that stick out in my mind of the most effective instruction that I've ever delivered were the kinds when I was simply like kind of using your example of just having a general direction that I wanted to go with the class, and then responding to the students in the moment to figure out what the objectives were in the moment. Because I'm looking at their eyes, I'm looking to see when they're confused and when they kind of smile a little bit to indicate that they've got it. And I'm like playing them like a joystick. And that's when, to me, that's when education is the most exciting, is when I don't know what the objective will be until we're doing it. And that's a pretty cool thing. And so I think, in fact, just a funny story, I had a colleague that was not happy about that policy of always displaying their learning objectives. I wasn't happy either. I just didn't really care. But he decided the administrator was going to come in and observe to make sure that they were there. And his learning objective was suck less. That's it.
That's a learning objective.
Yeah. But of course, the administrator was not happy. And he just goes, well, I just figure it'll work today, and that same one will work again tomorrow.
Yep.
Like, all right. So can you think of any others? Are there any other that fall outside of your area of research that people just assume is true?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are other things like learning styles. So I'm sure you've heard before, whether you're an audio learner, visual learner,
Yep.
or kinesthetic, I think is the other one. This idea that we will learn best in a certain way. So, maybe would you learn best if you're going to watch a video of this interview that we're having or listen to it on a podcast? I don't know how you do it kinesthetically, but somehow. And so this is a really pervasive thing in education. We were all taught this as kids. I'm sure you were too. I was taught to think about what my learning style is. And a lot of times as teachers, we're encouraged to teach students according to learning styles. But this is another one that's a myth. Not only is it a myth that teaching students in their preferred learning style is better, it's honestly a myth that learning styles exist at all. We have preferences. We have what we would prefer to engage with, but a lot of times our preferences are about what's easiest. And as an educator, that what is easiest is probably not what's driving you to be best. So you learn the most when you encounter something that's challenging to you. And so none of us really do have this, we learn better if I listen to this podcast. Instead, it challenges us most and we learn best when we encounter content in multiple ways.
Yeah, that's really good and really interesting. Now, just a quick note to my audience. She's not quite right there. You do learn better when you listen to this podcast. But no, all the other ones, that's not the case. I'm teasing. I'm teasing.
Yes.
So, okay, that's great. I thought of a question about before my questions got out of order here for a second, but back to your research. When you were splitting up your classes and teaching different sections in a different way, do you not get in trouble for that? How did your bosses feel about that?
So I'm really lucky. I teach college. So college professors have academic freedom, which means that the content of what we teach is something that we have almost full control over. And, the reason for academic freedom is because college professors have to teach about complicated and controversial things. As we've seen with these bills that are coming up, preventing K-12 teachers from teaching critical race theory or other controversial subjects, college professors have always been insulated from that. So I was able to use my own, curiosity in how this would affect my classroom to change my style in 3 different courses. And then at the end, once the courses had already been delivered, we could analyze that data. So no, we don't get in trouble. We're college professors.
Well, that's good. That's great. And the reason I thought of that question, because of course, I'm familiar with the concept at the higher ed level, but I feel like at the same time, is there any kind of pushback, or even maybe from colleagues, just the idea that you're trying to prove something wrong that's so cherished and accepted, or is that something maybe even outside of academia? But do you deal with that ever?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, because from our colleagues, so our fellow faculty members, they were pumped. They were excited that we were doing this. And part of our study was, in fact, asking our colleagues what their perceptions of learning objectives were. And our colleagues were almost universally unfavorable toward learning objectives. We have some really great quotes in our article. Someone said something like, I don't know how we've managed to teach for thousands of years without, learning objectives handed to us by assessment professionals. So the colleagues we had were very in favor of us figuring out the answer to this question, even though we kind of felt like we already knew it. We all know that this is not meaningful. What we end up getting is people in assessment offices or administration offices that try to impose these strategies on us. And so the entire motivation for the project was when an instructional designer told me I needed to have learning objectives and write them in a certain way. Otherwise, my students wouldn't learn. And I was so mad at her that I went and published a whole paper about it.
Okay.
So I don't know if she knows that she was the motivation for my paper. And even though on TikTok, when I talk about research like this about learning objectives and, them not making a difference, I get some people who are upset at the finding there too, that they're upset at the idea that learning objectives aren't useful, or that they don't have to be useful. And let me be clear, I'm fine with anyone using objectives if you think they're useful to you. So
Yeah.
anyone who's teaching a class, if they like using learning objectives, they should be allowed to. I am just opposed to mandating their use when there's just no strong evidence that this is the case.
That makes total sense. Now, I think when you were talking about that instructional designer, I kind of just assumed that that was someone in an administrative position in your school that was telling you to do that. Not the case?
No, that was
Oh,
sort of an
okay.
assessment. So
Uh-huh.
the instructional designers are people who consult with faculty on how best to design their courses. They exist at the K-12 level in some districts as well.
Okay.
And oftentimes what they're doing, when they're doing their best work, they're taking your ideas for how to deliver content and making it actionable. So how can we turn this into a cool activity or a cool graphic or a cool interactive component for students. But at their worst work, they're sort of acting as this compliance officer to make sure you're following the rules.
Got it. Yeah, we don't like them.
Nope.
Okay, so we've had a couple examples already of times where we get it wrong. Are there any like truly popular and evidence-based and solidly supported um, ways to teach?
That is a really great question. So there's nothing that is so compelling that you should be forced to use it. I haven't yet come across anything that compelling,
Uh-huh.
but I have come across things that I would advocate for if you would, you or any educator would be willing to give them a try.
Yeah.
So the two that I sort of have tentative recommendation for, first is universal design for learning. So this goes back to that idea of learning styles, this sort of old school idea that what we should do is have auditory and visual and kinesthetic, and, that we should have leveled versions of the curriculum. So leveled readers. So if students aren't reading at grade level, they should be given a lower grade level or a higher grade level. That style of differentiation, and it replaces it with the idea that the way we teach should be accessible for all learners. And that's a really broad statement, so it can be actioned in multiple ways. But if we think about this, looks like providing scaffolding. This looks like providing alternative text for people who can't see images. It looks like teaching in multiple modalities and revisiting concepts in different ways. And I think this is stuff that we're already doing. I think
Mm-hmm.
this is how we teach. We know that this is the way students learn when we try to find new ways to give them the same information, but it just makes it more explicit. So I have tentative recommendation for that.
Now, is that different or distinct from air quotes differentiated instruction?
It sort of is and sort of isn't. So
Okay.
differentiation means a lot of things. Everybody's going to, define it in a different way. The differentiation I don't like is the kind where there's one version of instruction for gifted students and one version of it for, the less gifted students. Because I think what that does is it silos students. Then, the ones who are not in the gifted program, they know they're not in the gifted program. So then it makes them feel like they're on the dumb track.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't challenge them. It doesn't give them any good, meaningful way of understanding the curriculum. And then the gifted students, if they're siloed with other gifted students, well, they're not really being challenged either, because they're going to interact with people at all ability levels at all times in their life. And I think we also often see tracking students in the gifted program is so correlated with things like family income. It's hard to really say those students are just that much smarter. So that kind of differentiation, I think, is no good. But the kind of differentiation where we just think about different ways to offer the same information to the same kids,
Mm-hmm.
that kind I think is good and very much consistent with UDL.
Okay, so then you said that was universal design for learning? Is that
For learning.
for
Yep.
learning? Okay, so then you said there was a second one. Is there a second one that you
There's a
advocate
second
for?
one that I do tentatively advocate
Yeah.
for anybody who's willing to try it, and that is learning cycle models. So a learning cycle model is distinct from the sort of traditional way of teaching, which is just lecture and test, lecture and test. And, I fall into the trap of lecture and test because I teach in college, and it's really tempting to just be that sage on the stage. But the learning cycle model kind of tries to move students through a cycle where we're engaging them at the beginning, we're explaining something to them, we're letting them explore it, and then we're evaluating them. And then that evaluation just funnels them right into the next engagement. And I think that's something, it really originated in the sciences, in the natural sciences, so things that would have lab investigations. But it's been filtering out into other types of other disciplines as well, where we're trying to keep students learning in a cycle rather than just saying, I talk at you for 50 minutes and then you take a quiz or you do a lab.
Right. Right. Now, circling back to what you said a second ago about how they're just not being any particular methods that are so well grounded in evidence that they should be mandated. I want to kind of touch on that a little bit because I think there's, for some people, and this could be where some of the pushback you get on TikTok. Did I just say TikTok? I did. I will not edit. I will not edit that out. That's how free flowing we are here. So on TikTok, you get some pushback, just knowing what I do, the little bit I do about psychology, I would imagine that there are some people, when confronted with a statement like you just said, which is that there just aren't any that are so well grounded in evidence that we should make people do it. Even that makes people kind of feel uncomfortable, because the people, like you said, the reason we vote for politicians earlier, we were talking about needing an answer. Well, sometimes the people on the ground need an answer too. They feel more comfortable if they're just told, this has been proven that this works. Go do it. Again, question, am I crazy?
No, I don't think you're crazy at all. I think it is more comforting to have certainty, even if our certainty isn't correct.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this plays out in all aspects of politics and life,
Yep.
where it feels better to be certain about something. And it is difficult to be challenged, and not to be challenged to say you're wrong, this is the other answer, but instead to be challenged to say you're not wrong, but you're not right either. That's a really uncomfortable place to live. And that's the place that science lives. Science always lives there.
Yeah, it kind of puts, there's a certain type of person that is not comfortable with the idea that their every waking minute is going to have to be a search for truth. I would like for truth to be delivered to me on a silver platter, please, thank you. And I would like for that, and I would like for that to happen in my PD before 9 o'clock, so that I can have my coffee and then go teach my next class, knowing exactly what to do. And I think that's unfortunate, but it's just human nature in a sense. We probably all do it in some areas of our lives. We can't be I guess really we like to think of ourselves as critical thinkers all the time, but we can't really be. If we critically thought about everything that we did all day long, we would be neurotic.
That is totally true.
Sometimes you just have to accept something on faith and go forward. I think where my beef, and it sounds like your beef might be a little bit, because again, the reason I reached out to you in the first place was because I felt like I saw someone saying something that I've been trying to say for so long as a teacher, but then of course I'm not an expert in this, so no one listens to me. And so it's a frustration that, like, no, I want to develop my own teaching methods that I think work really well because I've tried them and work really well with the style that I teach, and which also, by the way, reflects my personality, which you can't test in a lab because you can't recreate me. And so, like, and on this show, even just as an example, I outline a lot for my colleagues of the way I teach things. And I kind of, it's one of the reasons the show is successful, is I have a method of certain things that I do and I present them here. But one of the first things I say is, you're going to have to figure out how the you version of this, right? So because
Right.
a lot of what works for me works because I'm me and the way I teach, and it wouldn't necessarily work for you. You'd have to figure out your own thing. And I think that kind of wraps nicely around to how we started the conversation, which was you explaining the social sciences and how it's just not like physics, and it's probably that unending variables of humans. Is that a
Yeah.
fair?
And I think that's totally true. And I think it even dovetails into other sort of scientific endeavors. When we look at how people have reacted to changing evidence about COVID, so we know a lot more about how COVID works. than we did at the beginning. And honestly, a lot of the questions that we ask about COVID are social science questions. If we are asking questions about how people use vaccines and whether people take a vaccine, and then people who don't take vaccines, do they get COVID more? And is that because they didn't get the vaccine? Is that because they are already engaging in other less safe practices? These are evolving questions, and we know more every time more evidence comes to us. We're never going to be able to say this is the answer. If we all just wear a mask, COVID will be gone forever.
Yes.
We can't know that, but we can
just
try
became
to
best
get
friends.
better.
We just became best friends. Oh my God.
Good.
That's been a frustration of mine from the beginning, which was that COVID, because it's a social science. When you said it's a social science question, a lot of the things are a social science question. For example, even just to say something is safe or not safe is a social science question, because what is safe to who, and for what period of time? How do you define that? How do you measure that? Well, obviously, you measure it with people's values, and
Right.
and that's social science.
And I'm going to stop you because it's still not. We're not to social science. So social science, yeah. So I'm going to finally disagree with you on something.
Yay.
So social science, even itself, can't tell us what is good, bad, what we should do. So any science question still can't answer what should we do. So I could tie this both to COVID and to education. So if we get good scientific evidence that says wearing masks would reduce the spread of COVID, that's a social science question because it's people engaging in behavior. So we're looking at people's behavior to look at a reduction in an outcome.
Yep.
Now, we can't use that to say, so what should we do? Should we mandate masks? The science can't tell us that. That's where our values come in. So we have to say, if our value is eliminating COVID, then we absolutely should mandate it. The mask evidence is obviously more mixed than vaccination evidence, which I think is hard for people to wrap their heads around. Like, if we knew if everyone would just get vaccinated, we could almost eliminate COVID. That's probably the case. So should we mandate vaccines? Well, maybe I think so, maybe you think so, but our values tell us the answer to that. And so science can't tell us what should we do about it. Okay, so we know this is variable A and it causes variable B. So what should we do? We don't know. Science can only tell us the relationship between those variables. And coming back to education, even if we knew with certainty, science says if you write learning objectives on the board, students' test scores go up. That still doesn't mean by itself, so we should write learning objectives on the board. That we have to say, so what are our values? What are our priorities? What are we doing instead of writing, if we write learning objectives on the board, what time is that taking away from other things? We have to use our values to make the decision of what to do with the science.
What are we giving up by doing that? What opportunity cost? It's a concept of opportunity cost.
Right.
Yeah.
Back to economics, the male-dominated patriarchy field.
That's my fault. I'm just oozing toxic masculinity the whole time we're talking, and I'm horrible. And I think these are all great examples, because I think this is a really great way to think of it. Even in the way that, since you used the example of masking earlier in COVID, of people not understanding how confounding variables work. If I'm going to test County A with their masking policy, and County B does not have a masking policy, but County A also has much higher rates of vaccination, and then you come back later and say, well, masking worked. Well, did it?
Probably the vaccination.
Or was it the vaccines that worked? Or is it because both that county was doing both of those things, which indicates that their values are to be more careful about COVID-related stuff? And so they're also probably not making out with strangers in clubs as much in County A. And and I think that's where is that social science? What I'm describing?
So yes, what you're describing
on,
what's their behavior and what are confounding variables, that's something that social science is really, really good at, because we have to get good at identifying what those are, because we don't have lab conditions. So my husband always tells me when I go on this tear, that he's like, be careful, don't sound like an anti-masker, and I'm not at all. But, I think it's really important. for us to consider, what does the science actually say, and how do we use our judgment on what to do about the science? We could talk about this with climate change. The science is pretty clear and compelling that human activity leads to rising global temperatures, but so what should we do about it? Well, we don't know. We can't say, well, therefore we should pass the Green New Deal. That's not what the science says. It doesn't say what we should do.
Yeah. Don't worry about that. I sell on this show masks. They're made. They're designed for singers. But at the same time, my audience knows I don't support mandating them in all situations, because I've studied the science of them so much, because I wanted to not sound like an idiot when I was presenting this product, that I understand that so the way I explain it is masks work and then masks don't work are both true.
Yep.
It depends on context and how you wear them, and for how long you wear them, and where you're wearing them, around who, those types of things. Are you vaccinated? There's all these other types of things that play into it. And so I think if you're, it's funny that your husband says that, because that is that's the place that we are. And I think this also relates to the conversation around education research too. There is a certain amount of hesitancy for people to hear that the thing that they cherished as true and real and settled, the science is settled, so to speak, might not be settled. It might actually be an open question, and then that makes people go, oh, but then I have to think more.
Right. Yeah. If we acknowledge that the science on masks is mixed, then people who are either 100% against or 100% pro masks both feel lost in that conversation. I think a lot of nuance gets lost all the time when we talk about these really difficult conversations, like what should we do in education? Because all of us have probably a value of kids. We want kids to succeed. We want kids to do well. And because we all prioritize that, we come to this place of so then tell us what to do. And the nuance is lost on this is going to look different in every classroom, in every child's life. There's not one solution that can answer everything. And we have to be able to take a nuanced value. We have to think about it in a nuanced way. Otherwise, we end up with these mandates, write learning objectives on the board, that make us feel like we're doing something, but it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. You're just killing this. I love this. It's so much fun. I could hang out all night, but let's kind of go with one more topic. It kind of wraps all this up. So again, thinking that as people are sitting here listening to this, my audience, yes, mostly music teachers, but probably mostly public school music teachers, that are kind of in the belly of the beast, so to speak. I feel like we now public school teachers, are the experimental lab for a lot of these things. We're the ones that get forced to do them, whether they work or not. So what would be your best advice on the way out for a teacher working in public school or private school, or any place that is presented with these initiatives, being told that they're evidence-based, and understanding you don't want to incite a riot at the next PD meeting, but what are some questions that you ask, or you would think we should ask? What are some ways that we could communicate? What are some ways that we can continue to stretch our own teaching practice, even though we're constrained by some questionable science?
Yeah, so I think I've got kind of two answers. So obviously it's hard. We get mandated to do things we don't want to do all the time. So there's language in my syllabus that I don't think should be there, because I think it makes students not read my syllabus. But it doesn't matter. It has to be there, or else I actually do get in trouble. So college professors do get in trouble for some things. But I think one thing that we can ask the people who are mandating these things of us is something like, how can I make this practice work in my classroom given this? So, if I'm saying, how can I make this language in my syllabus work, given that I'm already struggling to get my students to read the syllabus? What flexibility do we have? And getting an answer of okay, well, you could put all of that at the very end after the stuff that you think is important, so that so that you can prioritize the things you really want your students to pay attention to. So sometimes we can push just a little to get some flexibility on, how these look when we implement them. Trying to make sure that if you're the music teacher and you just got told you have to do the 5E model of learning cycles, and you're going, what do I do here? Your PD coordinator is not going to be able to tell you. They can't tell you how to make it work in your classroom. But if you can push for a little flexibility to say, I don't think this explore step is going to work, because if I let my music students, explore on their own, then they're going to be playing flutes with their ears, and it's not going to work.
We won't be ready for the concert.
Exactly. So then to say, can I modify it in this way? I think usually they're going to say yes, or usually they're going to give you a little bit of wiggle room. So I think that's the first step. And that's an actionable thing you can do, is to ask for some flexibility on how it's applied, not, in general, what's happening. But more importantly, and this is like a long-term goal, is I think we have to get more and more teachers demanding better. I think we have to demand better of our administrators. We have to demand better of our school boards. We need to be voting in school board elections, because those people are elected and they are the ones that are deciding whether we can teach critical race theory or whether we have to use this curriculum or another one. We have to be actively vocal in these conversations. It's not acceptable for us to check out. So that's the bigger one, and it's harder to do, but I think it's really important.
Well, now that's a good point. And thinking about even just bringing the critical race theory example into it, it seems like, at least in my local board election, we're talking more about that than we're talking about instructional models in the classroom. I would much rather vote on board members based on that, based on how do you plan to support us being able to teach the way that is the most effective for students. I'm not saying no one should be talking about the critical race theory topic, but for a school board member, I would think that that's what I would rather them care about. If that makes sense. And one thing I've noticed, as somebody who is a big enough nerd to have read critical race theory before Donald Trump uttered that phrase, and all of a sudden everyone cared about it, is that one thing I've noticed is that people who think CRT is good and people who think it's bad usually have one really important thing in common, which is neither of them know what it is.
That is definitely true. I teach critical race theory in some of my college classes. And so I write it on the board, and I think this is the day that a student's going to take a picture of the board and send it to Fox News. But yes, I find too that I usually get a lot of students who are like, wait, that's it? That's all it is? Why are we talking about this so much?
Yep. Yeah, because they're not talking about it. They're talking about something else.
They're talking about something else.
And I think it's true that like people on both sides of the issue do it.
I don't think that ignorance is concentrated on one side of the political aisle. I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, and that's frustrating. In fact, so tying that to the school board thing and advocating as teachers, like being demanding better, and I think that's kind of maybe where I'd like to leave this, and then give you a final word. Where as teachers, I think maybe that's the hardest thing for us to do, is demand better, because we're afraid to lose our jobs, or we're afraid to make an administrator angry, who then we might have to ask for a favor later. And so sometimes it's just easier to bow your head and shuffle off from the PD meeting and go do it. And for many years in my career, I would, I'm not really a shuffler, but I would go off, and the way I would react is I would say, okay, I'm going to figure out how to fill out this worksheet that we have to fill out, and take what I already do and put it in this language, and then go about doing what I was doing before. That's what I've always done. And I feel like that's what most teachers do, but then of course, why are we doing it?
Exactly. I think you've hit the nail on the head right there, is that when we compel and mandate and force, we're not getting the best practices anyway. So even if we knew this practice has the best evidence for it, as soon as you start cramming it down teachers' throats, it becomes less effective, just for the fact that you force them to use it without adequately supporting them. So I think you're absolutely right. And it is easier to check out. I will say, I don't think that we as educators should fall for this ploy to get teachers and parents fighting each other. I think that's something that's coming up a lot right now in discussions in school boards, is this idea teachers hear, well, all the parents are pushing for this. And so then they think parents are all mistrustful of them. And then parents are hearing, well, all these teachers are teaching inappropriate things to your kids. So the parents are thinking, well, wow, can I not trust my teachers? And it creates an adversarial relationship. We should not fall for it. Most parents are great and most teachers are great. I think it is an intentional goal to make parents and teachers not trust each other anymore. And that is something I think we should all leave with, is to know that we shouldn't just fall for that attempt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's very well said. And man, this was fun. It was fun to get you talking for more than 60 seconds.
Yes. And I would be remiss if I didn't let any science teachers in the audience know that the startup I work for is called Pocket Lab.
Yeah.
We do sell science sensors. I'm sure you don't have a big cadre of science teachers in your audience,
Not
but
many.
I did promise my colleague at work that I would mention it. So here we are, Pocket Lab.
Pocket Labs. And so just because I'm curious, what exactly do you do?
Yeah, so the Pocket Lab company has a platform for science lessons, and they're accompanied by sensors, the little Bluetooth sensors that will do things like, if you drop the sensor, it'll record the velocity and acceleration of the sensor falling to the ground. So pretty cool, pretty nifty.
That's very cool. And you don't have
somewhat
to have...
evidence-based. I would say not evidence-based enough to compel anyone to use it, but we do have some evidence that it works.
That's great. Well, I'd say not even just science teachers, but would people parents who have kids be a thing that they might want to look for their kids?
Yeah, there's especially one that's a little car. So it drives around. You can crash it into things, make a little crash crumple zone, see what happens.
Music teachers, you can go check out Pocket Labs too, especially if you have kids. I'll make sure I'll put a link in the show notes. We'll be in touch after we sign off, and we can get that in there. And then, of course, you got to plug your TikTok. How do we find you?
Yes, on TikTok, I am Dr. Mitchell 123. So that's DrMitchell 123.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell, for talking to me. This was a blast, and just lots of great information and things for us to chew on.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all so much for sticking around at the end of the episode. You know what to do on the way out. If you enjoyed this, share it, spread the word. Like I said, send it to your admin. Leave comments, leave ratings. All the things that you do to help people see the show are greatly appreciated. And of course, if you have your favorite annoying PD initiative story to share, go over to the Coralosophers Facebook page and share that story. I'm sure other people will have their stories as well. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate you all.